It should not happen to anybody in this country, that the powerful tools of intelligence are turned on you, we the people, as we have talked so often about. Now the question is, as we now hold them accountable, do they really care about outside foreign government influence in our elections? Because if they do, then they're going to pay attention to a story we have been following and telling you about that was broken by our friend John Solomon. Remember, John has been part of the very few in our group, our ensemble, if you will, that have been day by day unpeeling the onion and finding out the corruption in the deep state, the abuse of intelligence, the FISA warrants, the 350% increase in surveillance, unmasking, leaking raw intelligence, and so much more. And he has now uncovered a very, insidious situation that is happening with what happened in the 2016 election. John, how are you?
Good to be with you, Sean.
Why don't I let you explain, and the difference between Trump-Russia collusion and what we have as it relates to this Ukrainian plot is very interesting to me, because there's actual real evidence, and the Ukrainian parliament and more members of the Ukrainian government, they ruled back in December, that actions that were taken, quote, amounted to meddling in the 2016 American presidential election.
That's
Ukrainian
right.
lawmaker.
Yeah, absolutely. So what we know is that a court in Ukraine has concluded that what I would call the FBI of Ukraine, it's the Anti-Corruption Bureau, NABU it's called, in Ukraine, wrongfully intervened in the United States election by knowingly and willfully leaking documents about Paul Manafort's finances in Ukraine to the American media during the middle of the election. If you remember, right in that June, July, August time frame when Manafort was the temporary campaign chairman for the Trump campaign, all of a sudden these stories came out in the New York Times, AP, and other places about Manafort's dealings with the Party of Regions in Ukraine, and those all get leaked at the same time. The Ukraine court has concluded that NABU and its chief officials, senior officials, leaked that, and they did so intentionally with the goal of trying to influence the American election. That's a court finding. That's not a speculation. It's not an uncorroborated dossier. It's an official finding of the Ukrainian government. But beyond that, we now have surfaced in the last few weeks a Ukrainian member of parliament, through an order of a court, released an audio tape purporting to capture the NABU officials boasting that they did this leak intentionally because they preferred Hillary Clinton over Donald Trump. So here you have a Ukrainian government agency, both on tape and in through a court ruling, having been found to have tried to intentionally influence the election in favor of Hillary Clinton. And so it raises the question, well, what did Hillary Clinton's people know? Let's take you back to the spring of 2017 to a story that almost nobody paid attention to. But Politico had an article that reported that for some reason the Democratic National Committee and Hillary Clinton's campaign kept a full-time researcher in contact with the Ukrainian embassy in Washington. So Hillary Clinton is on the receiving end in Washington. She sets up a receiving post at a foreign embassy in Washington to find information on Donald Trump and Russia. And what's going on in Ukraine? Well, the NABU, the Ukrainian officials, are gathering that information and leaking it to the media. Now, there's a lot of steps that have to be connected before we make any assumptions. We don't want to run ahead like the dodgy dossier and do things like that. But we have an early pattern of a campaign taking an unusual step of planting someone at a foreign embassy, and now a foreign court ruling saying that country did indeed try to intervene in the U.S. election and did indeed try to help Mrs. Clinton.
Well, I mean, the amazing thing about this is, and frankly, a little ironic, the most ironic thing is obvious. You got shifty, cowardly Schiff on tape colluding with somebody he believes to be a Russian that had compromised material on Donald Trump. The nature of the compromise, naked Donald Trump.
Right.
Have you shared it with Putin? Of course. Yes, you shared it with Putin.
A very good recounting going on here.
Well, but the point is, there was we also have a dossier. I mean, imagine this, the 9-month investigation, FBI, nothing.
Yeah.
2 congressional investigations, they conclude no collusion. Now Mueller, no ambiguity.
That's right.
No collusion.
No collusion.
And they're still pushing it. And meanwhile, do they care at all about collusion? Do they care about the designed release of sensitive information about Paul Manafort in 2016 to help Hillary win? That would be outside electoral interference. Do they care about the issue, or is it just bludgeoning Trump? It doesn't matter that Hillary had a bought and paid for phony Russian dossier. It only matters if Trump did talk to a Russian, at at a Russian restaurant one day.
Well, the dual system of justice, when you hear the difference in the way the Democrats have treated the Ukrainian versus the Russian stuff, you see why so many Americans feel like there are two systems of justice going on. Let's draw a few more connections, again, that the American public has not heard of because the Democrats haven't spent any time investigating it. We now know, because of the deposition and testimony of Nellie Orr, that Nellie Orr gave information to her husband, the senior Justice Department official Bruce Orr, to give to the FBI on Donald Trump. What we learned this week, when her testimony was released by Congress, is that one of the primary sources of information that her company, Fusion GPS, that's Glenn Simpson, that's Christopher Steele, that's Nellie Orr, where did they get their information from? A Ukrainian parliamentary member in Ukraine. Again, another data point showing that the Democrats in this operation are relying on Ukraine to get information, dirt on Donald Trump during the election and trying to tie him to Russia. Now, let's keep in mind what's going on here. This could be a proxy war. Russia and Ukraine are neighbors that are at war with each other over Crimea during this very moment, and Ukraine may very well have had its own effort and desire to influence the election, and they're interfering. You don't hear any of this, even though the data points are sitting out in the open space, and that's where if Adam Schiff wants to run a credible investigation, he has to look at both of these things, yet he's not talking about half of it.
I want you to stand back. It was March of 2017 that you started this process. You and Sarah were on my show, and it was about surveillance and unmasking and no minimization and a 350% increase in unmaskings, which, by the way, we still need to get to the bottom of. And Samantha Power's, 300 requests to unmask people that she claims I know nothing about. I want you to stand back big picture, because now that the Mueller report's in, now that we know that Hillary's investigation was rigged and FISA and, deep state operatives turning the powerful weapons of intelligence on some Americans, what is the answer? In other words, I keep saying, Rush said it last night, the president has said it, this can't happen again. And you being so involved from the get-go, and by the way, I count maybe 25 of us total in the country against 99.999% of media and Democrats, et cetera. What is the answer to prevent it from ever happening again? Big picture, what do you think?
Well, I've always thought that punishment is the ultimate deterrent. That's why we have a prison system. That's why we have laws. Anyone who is involved in the United States intelligence apparatus that knowingly and willfully misled the FISA court, knowingly and willfully misled a president or the American public during election should be held accountable under whatever tools are available to us, whether they're criminal prosecution or administrative actions, termination, firing, discipline. But there is clear evidence that there have been a fraud, a misinformation campaign that was fed to the FISA court to allow the spying on a duly elected Republican nominee's campaign, and there's equal evidence that effort through leaking, coordinated leaking between the FBI and Steele, influenced the election, or certainly intended to influence the election in 2016. Donald Trump still won despite it. That has to be held accountable. Then there's a second line of accountability.
Well, hold on. I want to get to that in a second, but if I don't break, I'm going to get in trouble. Quick break. Right back. More John Solomon, investigative reporter with The Hill. All right, as we continue, John Solomon with The Hill is with us, investigative reporter and columnist. All right, I stopped you in the middle, but if we're going to prevent this from happening again, accountability, doesn't it have to then start with the rigged investigation into Hillary, the Espionage Act, obstruction of justice with her, or does it even go back earlier?
Well, it certainly has to start at least that soon, right? Because the mid-year exam, the investigation that cleared Hillary Clinton despite evidence of criminal negligence, is intricately and impossibly connected to the Russia investigation on so many levels, including the fact that the day Hillary Clinton gets a clean bill of health from James Comey, despite the evidence of criminality, that's the day that Christopher Steele walks into the FBI and says, oh, by the way, here's my dossier. There are so many, and it's the same players, Stroke and Page, are on both investigations. The way the FBI handled both investigations, pulling them out of the field office and letting a small group of politically biased executives run those investigations when the normal process is leave it in the field, the field agents. They're inextricably linked together because they were handled the same way by the same people with the same biases. So it has to start there. But as you wind forward, you have to look. There were co-conspirators in creating this narrative, and some of those co-conspirators are in my own profession. My own profession has to come clean about how it got things wrong, how it exaggerated, how it reported erroneous things. I always point to this story in the New York Times. February 2017, one of the seminal stories in the driving the narrative. It said that the New York Times reported there were senior Trump officials who met with senior Russian intelligence officials to coordinate the campaign. That did not happen. And when James Comey testified, it did not happen. The New York Times didn't correct it. When Bob Mueller came out with his report and said there was no collusion, the New York Times hasn't corrected that story. Instead, it spent most of its time apologizing for one of the stories that it had that might have been right. The October 31st, 2016 story that said there wasn't collusion probably going on.
Unbelievable. All right, last question. Everyone, well, we need the full report. You have sources. Anything in that report that differs from the AG's characterization and Rod Rosenstein's agreement on the issue of obstruction?
I don't think so. I think there's going to be a series of chronological events describing the activities around the firing of Comey and the go easy alleged comments that are made about Flynn. And those may extend beyond conversations the president had with Comey to some of his other aides. So, there's going to be a chronology that comes out, and people will draw their own inferences. Democrats will cry crime. Republicans will say there's not. But I don't think the body of fact is going to change much, and it is time to move beyond the questions that have gotten 2.5 years of investigation to the questions that have barely gotten any investigation. Ukraine, FISA abuse, all of the things that we've been talking about that the rest of the country has sort of ignored.
All right, great job, great work. And, yeah, holding them accountable is going to be probably as big or bigger job over time.
Right.
John Solomon, you should take a bow. There should be Pulitzers returned, and you should be up for one. And so should a lot of other people I know.
A long time ago, you're only as good as your next story.
Well, you know what? You're going to be working pretty hard for the next 2 years on peeling this onion. Trust me.